That's the other thing. Skype plus recording ends up with many people watching from far away and few people in the room. Anyway, I haven't said a word right till now. Welcome. I'm very happy to see everybody here this afternoon. This is the March version of the Centers for Disease Control, Prevention, Division of STD Prevention, and American Sexually Transmitted Diseases Association lecture series we call the Prevention Science Series. And today I am delighted to be able to introduce to you Tom Valente, who I know you have read a lot of, and we all have discussed a lot, his work, but Tom is delightful in person. He is Professor and Interim Chair in the Department of Preventive Medicine at the Keck School of Medicine at the University of Southern California. And I'm so knowledgeable, I have all these years assumed Tom was in San Diego at the University of Southern California. Last night he tells me, no, it's in Los Angeles. In case you thought, like I do, it's in San Diego, it's not. He has written 3 different books, Social Networks and Health, Models, Methods, and Applications, Evaluating Health Promotion Programs, and Network Models of Diffusion of Innovation, and almost 200 articles and chapters. So, very productive, but more importantly, I think, extremely creative and innovative. So we are particularly interested, of course, in his work on social network analysis and interventions using social network approaches. And he apparently, earlier in his career, is a communication scientist. And even prior to that, a math major. So those things, I'm sure, help as you're doing network analysis-based interventions in health. Tom, thank you so very much for being here.
Thank you, Sevgi, for the invitation and for being here. Yes. I'm delighted to be here and really appreciate this invitation and delighted to meet you all and share some ideas and talk about ways that we can move this field forward. So I've got just a brief outline. I'm going to do a quick introduction. My main focus has been using diffusion of innovations theory to understand how ideas and practices spread through communities, and in particular looking at network models of behavior change and then transitioning to network models for behavior change. Okay, so I don't have to tell many of you all in this room, social networks are ubiquitous and varied. They come from all different kinds of places and sources. There are researchers applying network methods to a wide variety of applications, stemming from cell biology all the way up to national, international, world systems. So there's lots of network work going on out there. And the field actually has evolved quite dramatically over the past few decades, in part because we started out with very rudimentary tools able to analyze social networks, but increasingly our tools have become really terrific to where we can analyze quite easily and readily networks of hundreds of thousands, in some cases tens of millions of nodes and hundreds of millions of links. And so I think it's been that technological advance that's made the work so much more accessible and so much more able to be applied to a wide variety of things. And of course, I don't have to tell you all here that networks, of course, are the path through which diseases and infections spread. And so it's critical that we understand those networks in order to be able to understand how diseases spread and how to slow them down. My own work lately has focused primarily on looking at adolescent social networks, going into schools and asking kids who their friends are. This is a network, one of hundreds that I have, of adolescent friendships in one school. You can simply ask kids to write down the names or the ID numbers off a roster of their friends, and you get a picture that looks something like this, right? And of course, you end up with 2 groups, a group over here on the right-hand side and one on the left-hand side, and that is, of course, because of gender, right? So boys are only friends with boys, girls are only friends with girls. When my daughter was 12 years old, I was delighted to see this kind of research result, right? Everybody's safe. We don't even have to worry about prophylactics and prevention. It's taking care of itself. So, and this tendency for homophily in networks is very, very strong. And at this stage, we have homophily on gender, of course, And the other thing that you see that's quite characteristics of networks is that there are some people that are much more popular than others. There's always a few kids that receive a lot of friendship nominations, and then others like myself who end up having lunch by themselves a lot, spend a lot of time in the library, and so on. The other thing we see, of course, is clustering on behaviors. It's not uncommon to see that kids in a group that are all connected to one another are more likely to report wanting to smoke or actually engaging in smoking or other kinds of risk behaviors that we become quite concerned about. So from a network perspective, of course, this data gives us an insight into how to understand this community and how behaviors cluster within it. Then, of course, by the 10th grade, boys and girls are mixing freely with one another, and you can't keep them apart, right? So now, all of a sudden, it's the time for us to bring prevention messages and start becoming concerned about what's happening in this network. And so we've traced networks for adolescents as they go from the 12th grade up through the 12-year-old to 18-year-olds, and see this evolution and how those networks change and give rise to different risk behaviors and so on. But there's a lot we can do with the network once we have it, right? And there's a whole field, of course, devoted to understanding models of networks and how networks exist and looking at them statistically. But my interest has always been on how networks potentially influence behavior. It's that cross between behavioral actions and network influences that's particularly important to me, and I think particularly important when it comes to applications and understanding how they affect behaviors that put people at risk for different conditions. So the theoretical scaffolding that I've always used for this is diffusion of innovations. It's an old theory. Diffusion of innovations has been around for over 100 years. It's probably our oldest social science theory, and in my estimation, one of the most developed. The premise is quite simple, that new ideas and practices enter a community from some external source or some shift in the underlying conditions, and then that idea or behavior or norm spreads through interpersonal contacts. And it's that spread through the networks that gives rise uniquely to the diffusion process, right? So there are many change processes that occur that don't require interpersonal communication or interpersonal interaction, but from my mind, the diffusion process is one uniquely concerned with how the networks structure and influence that spread and flow. So one of the principles of diffusion of innovations, of course, is that ideas and practices follow this S-shaped curve, that you have a few people who adopt early in the process, and then it starts to take off. Typically, as it reaches the more central members of the network, the spread can accelerate rather rapidly, and then, of course, it tailors off once we reach saturation. And you can graph this as a cumulative curve as well as an incidence curve, sometimes approximating a normal distribution. Now, when I first saw this curve in graduate school, I fell in love with it, right? The notion that you had this thing that perfectly describes the whole world and can make predictions, right? And marketers love this. They call this the hockey stick, right? You want to start to get your product out there and hit that hockey stick and have it take off. This is a lie. In other words, this is what you would expect under normal random conditions. But in fact, when you look at real-world data, you see lots of deviations from this kind of path, either accelerating or growing much more slowly. And it's the deviations from that curve that get rather interesting. So when I started my PhD, of course, as Sevgi had said, I had done my undergraduate degree in mathematics, so I got sort of fascinated with the notion that we can create a mathematical formula to extract rate parameters, both in terms of how fast that diffusion occurs and how much it inflects upward early or takes a long time to take off. Spent 6 months or so working on this, started to fit it to real-world data, and then I looked at it and I said, what? This is god-awful. It's just boring, right? There's really not that much to it, but it doesn't tell you very much about what's happening in the diffusion process. And so I opened up an Excel spreadsheet and decided to do a little experiment, which was to start with a hypothetical community of 100 people. These 100 people are free from sin, free from disease, free from any problems. Everything is perfect. And then there's 5 recalcitrants over here who decide that they're going to do something wacky and crazy, either get infected with a disease or start to use a cell phone or some new product. They interact with the 95 non-infected. They infect them at a rate of 1%, so you get about 4.75 new adopters at that time period, and now you have a pool of 9.75 that are now doing the new practice and so on. And if you follow this process down, right, it turns out that for 100 people over 10 time periods at a rate of 1%, you get this curve. And right, that's beautiful. It says perfect SIR model. People are susceptible, they get infected. In fact, this is probably just an SI model. We don't take into consideration recovery. But it gives you this nice S-shaped curve and explains everything. And the problem, as I said with this, is it's wrong because of clustering, because of homophily, because people end up being connected to one another and friends of friends become friends. You have clustering in networks. And so when you actually look at how diffusion occurs, it does something, like this, where it's bumpy, right? It's not a straight, smooth curve to heaven. It takes off inside a pocket of people, spreads real rapidly, then it gets stuck there, slows down, and you have to wait for the bridges to take it to another part of the cluster and get it to spread more widely. So it's this clustering that gives rise to different patterns of diffusion and gives rise to the different kinds of dynamics we see when we look at diffusion and networks. So I want to talk about the different ways that we have used social network to understand influences on behavior change. And there are a lot of models and methods out there that we approach in this thing, and the principal model has been an exposure model, right? Very simple idea. You have a set of close contacts. As those contacts do something, you're more likely to do it. Your exposure to the intervention or the idea goes up. And a lot of things happen during that exposure, right? They communicate information, normative practices, where to get new product if you need refills, how to fix it, and so on and so forth. All of the things that networks give us in terms of helping us make behavior change decisions. So I'm going to create a sort of stylized version here of a person's interpersonal network. And in the language of network analysis, of course, we have ego, who's connected to a set of 6 alters, simply called A, B, C, and D, and E at the moment, and F. Don't forget F, okay? Now, one of the things that we know from lots of behavioral research is that exposure is associated with adoption. The more your friends do something, the more you're likely to do it, right? And of course, as a majority of your friends start to do something, you start to think, I'm going to be on the outside if I don't do it. So there's a lot of pressure to conform to what your network does. But we also know that perceived use is associated with use. So, for example, if I think my friends are smokers, regardless of whether they self-report as smokers, I'm more likely to smoke. And that's true for alcohol use, and that's true for a lot of other things. And those perceptions are much more stronger than the actual behaviors that the people self-report. And we have 4 or 5 studies now that have shown that in repeated settings. And that makes sense, right? Perceptions are everything. It's not... if I think my friends like me, they like me, regardless of whether they actually do or not. We also know that so-called Simmelian ties are associated with influence. Now, Simmelian ties come from Georg Simmel, a German sociologist, who postulated that the way people interact with their friends is influenced in large part by the relations that they have with each other. So it turns out that the influences on my behavior from A and B are stronger than they are from C and F, simply because A and B reinforce one another, and I'm connected to them through a transitive triplet, and that increases my desire to conform to their behaviors. More generally, we have a couple of studies that have shown that the overall density around my interpersonal network influences my behavior, right? So if all of my friends are friends, then as they do things, I'm more likely to do them. Their behaviors reinforce one another. They are all conforming to that same kind of behavior, and so I'm much more likely to then conform to their behavior. Tie strength is associated with influence, and I like to say actually that tie strength matters a whole lot. The more closely connected I am to a person, the more likely they are to influence me, right? And I actually tend to believe that we have a lot of people that think that weak ties are really strong because of Granovetter's Strength of Weak Ties article, which is really famous, really important, and says a lot of things. But what that weak tie argument said was basically that weak ties are very influential for spreading information. So in particular, if I want access to new job opportunities, I'm going to get that information from people that I'm weakly connected to, because those are people I don't see often and who travel in circles that are different than the circles that I travel in. So they have access to novel information I don't normally have access to. So the weak ties are good for spreading of information, opportunities, rumors, and things like that. But they're not very strong when it comes to making behavioral choices and behavioral decisions. And I actually think that the more consequential the behavior, the more important tie strength comes into play. So if I'm deciding to buy a new car, I'm going to rely on my very closest connections, my spouse, perhaps if I have an adult child or a parent that I'm going to confront, because those are the people that I'm closest to. And as a consequence, then they really are important to my behavioral decision. But if I'm going to decide something that's non-consequential, say what I'm going to order at lunch today when I'm out with my colleagues, I don't necessarily have to, I can actually ask somebody at the table next to me, what do you get here? What do you like, right? So that tie strength then is associated with the importance of the decision. Now, there's some evidence that indirect exposure may play a role in behavioral choices, so the friends of my friend and so on. There's been a little bit of controversy in this domain. Some people have postulated that indirect influences can go out 3 steps. Some people think only 2. Some people think only direct ties matter. And I think there's more research to be done on this to sort of figure out. It may vary by the kinds of behaviors we're talking about or the kinds of networks and so on, but that's unclear. And it's also unclear whether or not this intermediary individual needs to be engaged in the behavior for the 2-step people to have an influence on ego's choices. So that's an open research question. We also have this notion of structural equivalence. Now, in network, structural equivalence means people that actually occupy the same position in the social network. So in this case, both ego and D are connected to exactly the same other people. So from a network perspective, ego and D are perfectly substitutable, and they are perfectly structurally equivalent. And Ron Burt made the argument in 1987 that people who occupy structurally equivalent positions can monitor each other's behavior and, in fact, may be in competition for resources, prestige, and so on, recognition within the network, and as a consequence, those structurally equivalent authors can provide influences on our behavior. Now, this may be particularly true in a business context where firms that are structurally equivalent are actually in competition with one another. They may be in the same place in the supply chain or in the consumer marketplace, and so they monitor each other's behavior and will make decisions and adoption behaviors based on what their competitors do. So it's another mechanism of network influence. The other thing that Burt suggested is that analogously to trying to look at the influences of direct ties and indirect ties, you can expand or contract the radius of social influence to be either very strong for structurally equivalent authors or expand it so that it's weaker. You allow less structurally equivalent others to have an influence on your behavior. So for both direct ties and for structurally equivalent, we can expand or contract that radius of social influence, that radius of perception in which we allow ego to be influenced by their network. We can get even trickier with network data because we might hypothesize that people who are more important in the network exert stronger influences on others. So in this case, person C receives a lot of friendship nominations, for example, from others in the network. So C is very popular. If C does something, that may have a bigger influence on my behavior than if it's done by F or B or A, right? Because I know C is very, very important in the network, and if C is going to do it, then it may be something that I need to do to stay current with what's going on in the network, right? And then finally, the thing that's got a lot of us perplexed, excited, crazed is the role of mediated communications, right? Your social media ties, other kinds of internet influences that you can have, computer-mediated communication. There's evidence to suggest that online networks influence our behaviors also. The evidence also suggests that that influence is very, very small compared to face-to-face or interpersonal communication. So we know from a lot of media research that impersonal communications are less effective on us than interpersonal or personal communications. Nonetheless, we have lots of online ties, right? We can have hundreds and thousands of Facebook friends. And so we can get a lot of communication from the media that can influence us. And exactly how those two things interact with one another, I think, remains unclear and is ripe for a lot of future research. The other thing that we've discovered is that people are more strongly influenced by those with whom they share activities or participate in events in. So, for example, in the adolescent context, children who are teammates with one another are more likely to be influenced by each other than those that aren't teammates, or those that belong to the same clubs or have the same cultural identities, right? So if I'm friends with a couple of people and there's a couple of them with whom I share cultural identities, we're both skaters and we both play on the baseball team, I'm more likely to be influenced by their behaviors than my friends with whom I don't share those activities. So these things become reinforcing in many ways. The other factor, of course, is the attributes of those alters that you're influenced by. As we saw in that earlier slide, boys are friends with boys and girls are friends with girls. So if most of my friends are people of the same gender as I am, I'm perhaps more likely to be influenced by them rather than the friends that I don't share that gender or ethnicity or some other characteristic that matters to me. So you've now got to think about weighting our exposures by the attributes of those alters. And then finally, the thing that I discovered in my dissertation was this notion of network thresholds. That is, that there are some people willing to do things before many others in their network do them, and other people that wait until everybody they know does it before they're willing to do so, right? So I am unabashedly a high threshold adopter. I wait till everybody I know does something before I'm willing to do that. Why? Because I'm smart. I know it's going to take a while to figure out how to use that thing, what its features are, what do I do if it breaks, why should I bother doing it, right? So I wait until everybody else does it. But there are other people who like to be early in their network to do things. They want to be the first ones to adopt something. They want to be the ones that learn how to use it, and they take pride in explaining to other people how it works and what it's done. So these are people that do something that I would never do in my wildest dreams, and that is read the manual. Right? Read the instructions that come with whatever you buy. Because I'm going to depend on other people to explain to me how to use it. But the person who's first in their network doing it, they have to read the manual and the instructions to know how it works. Right? So, and then here's a nice graph of social network thresholds. These are from one of the classic diffusion network data sets, time of adoption for women when they first started using contraception in the 1960s along the x-axis, and the proportion of their network doing something on the y-axis. And so you can see there are some early adopters here who are also early in their network, right? But you also have some people up here who are early adopters, but they're actually waiting until other people in their network do it before they're willing to do it. And you can find late adopters over here who are actually only late adopters because of their position in the network makes it that they're exposed to the idea very late. So they don't have the opportunity to adopt it until that very late time. Okay? So one of the takeaways from this is when we do behavioral research and we look at how networks influence the spread of behaviors, we actually have all of these different exposure mechanisms that we can test. And some of them may be operant for different kinds of behaviors and different kinds of people. And so in a way, it makes it very difficult for us to really pinpoint exactly how networks influence behavior. So when I started down this path of research 30 years ago, I thought this is easy. You build an exposure model, it's correlated with adoption, and you're done, right? But now it turns out 30 years later, we're still trying to figure out how this stuff works. So I find that pretty interesting. A lot of this work, or some of the theoretical work I've done, I've based it on these three classic diffusion network data studies: the medical innovation data collected by Coleman, Katz, and Menzel in the 50s, the Brazilian farmers' adoption of hybrid seed corn in the 60s, and the Korean family planning study. These are fascinating because all three of these studies have this unique characteristic of knowing when individuals did a particular thing and having a lot of data on the networks that connect them. They're also interesting because they come from three different continents and involve three different behaviors, so ostensibly provide a sort of rather wide view of the diffusion process to be tested across a number of different settings. I point that out because doing this kind of empirical work took a lot of energy and a lot of coding, and in the past couple of years, through a generous grant by the, not generous, a good, nice grant by the NIH, the National Cancer Institute, we were able to develop an R library called NetDiffuser that provides statistical analysis, visualization, simulation, and diffusion and contagion processes on networks, easy to estimate and do. So all of those exposure functions that I was talking about are now built into a function quite easily, where you can just toggle switches to make different kinds of exposure calculations, calculates thresholds for you, calculates hazard rates, Moran's I, which is a contagion coefficient, as well as two new terms we developed, one called infectiousness and another called susceptibility. And then we have really nice visualizations built into the system. I do a workshop on NetDiffuser. We won't, chain you here for the next 3 hours and force you to learn how to use this software, but just want you to know that it's out there, it's available, and those classic diffusion data sets come with the library, so they're automatically loaded and provides a decent teaching tool. So what I love about those diffusion network data sets is they had network data and they had time of adoption, which is really strange to think that so few studies have actually collected those two pieces of information, because we have hundreds, if not thousands, of studies of networks, and we have hundreds and thousands of studies of behavior change, but those two don't. The Venn diagram is very incomplete, right? And the trouble with those classic diffusion data sets are that, the data were collected a long time ago. They provide pretty inexact measures of time of adoption. The networks were only measured at one point in time. The networks were static, so they weren't dynamic. And we know that networks and behaviors are changing all the time. They evolve, and we know some of the rules about how they evolve. Fortunately, we were able to discover a pretty unique data set, which was based on when countries ratified something called the Framework Convention for Tobacco Control. So this is a public health treaty introduced by the World Health Organization in 2003, mandating lots of restrictions on tobacco marketing, sales, use, and so on, right? And you all are pretty familiar with this kind of thing. Puts restrictions on where you can smoke, warning labels on packages, bans on advertising, and so on and so forth. So it turns out we have data on exactly when countries ratified the FCTC. And we also have data on a whole bunch of country attributes, right? We know a lot about countries. And we can also get data on the networks that connect different countries, their trade, their distance, tobacco trade. And we had this very unique data set called Global Link. And Global Link was a forum for, I used to have a slide on Global Link. It was a forum on communication about tobacco control issues. So over 7,000 tobacco control advocates from 1992 to 2012 joined Global Link, and they would post messages to one another. There were news feeds available. You had to have somebody already on Global Link vouch for you as a tobacco control advocate in order to get on the system. So we were able to extract 3 different networks from the Global Link data. Referrals, other people referred you to be on Global Link. Your post to communications that occur on Global Link, and co-subscriptions. That is, there were 43 different news feeds you could subscribe to, and so countries were connected to the extent that their tobacco control advocates subscribed to the same services. So now we run a diffusion network analysis to find out if networks were associated with the ratification of this new treaty. And the first thing we do, of course, is test for time effects and find that ratification occurred very fast early in the process, all right? And then when we do our exposure analysis, we find that countries that are exposed to ratifications by other countries they so subscribed with were much more likely to ratify the Framework Convention for Tobacco Control. So that seemed to be the social influence process that was driving the diffusion and adoption of this new treaty. However, I was fortunate enough to take a sabbatical in 2010, 2011 when I was writing this proposal, and I did a lot of thinking over a nice French carafes of red wine about what it means, what's unique about diffusion. And the unique thing about the diffusion process is it occurs over time. And there are really 4 network behavioral influences that occur over time. And those 4 influences are influence, what I've been talking about, but also selection, external influence, and opinion leaders. And I theorized that external influence would decrease over time, right? Now you think about it. People have a preference for getting information from their peers. If there's nobody in your network doing something, the only way you can be influenced by it is some media communications or some external source. But as time goes by and as the process spreads, as the diffusion spreads, there's going to be people in my network that are doing it that I can turn to for advice. So external influence isn't important, right? And so we know from marketing that it's really important to launch good media campaigns when a product is being introduced because nobody knows about it, but it's not very important once the product is well established. Selection is the process of making changes to your network to be compatible with your behavior. So if I'm a new kid that's going to start smoking in a school and nobody else is smoking in my school except for one other person, I've got to go be friends with that person, right? I've got to make changes to my network to be compatible with my behavior. But again, as more and more people adopt the innovation, I don't have to change my network to have somebody in my network doing it, so that's going to decrease over time. Influence, personal influence, will increase over time. Right? As it becomes normative, as it becomes accepted, I'm much more likely to allow my network to influence me. And the one effect that I'm not sure of its shape is the role of opinion leaders. Okay? So we know that opinion leaders are not the earliest adopters of innovations. They wait and hesitate. Why? Because if they adopt something that nobody else is using, they're taking a chance. They're taking a risk that they're going to do something that won't become accepted and they will lose their position of prestige. So you will find that people who are real opinion leaders in networks actually are very cautious about what they do, and they wait to make sure it's going to be accepted before they're willing to do it. And we know our political leaders won't go out on the ledge for anything, right? So we have evidence for this. We also know that opinion leaders will be earlier in the adoption process, in the diffusion process, if it's an innovation that's compatible with the cultural norms of the community. So we know, for example, that popular kids are more likely to become smokers in school in which smoking will have high prevalence, but late adopters in schools that will have low prevalence. So there's an interaction between the cultural compatibility and the role of opinion leaders. So this curve, right, the extent that they're going to adopt early or late and have influences early or late will move around depending on the culture, the cultural settings, as well as the behavior that we're talking about. So I was able to apply what I think is a very theoretical model to this diffusion data, and I find some support for it. And specifically, I created interaction terms between time of adoption of exposure and these different kinds of influences. And we find it doesn't attain, the traditional statistical significance of 0.05, it's 0.12. God, didn't I want to take Kyrgyzstan out of the data or something to make it work for me, but I couldn't. So we have trending for a couple of these hypotheses, but they were suggestive that these are really the way the diffusion process occurs, so I was kind of happy about that. And I was particularly happy about it because it was something that I sort of sat down, thought about, talked a lot about with my spouse and colleagues, and built this theoretical model, got data for it, and tested it and find some support for it. So it's not ironclad support, but it was suggestive. Okay, so that's all of the sort of ideological work and the theoretical work about how networks influence behavior. What you really came to find out is how do we use networks for behavior change, right? How do we create network interventions? And the question simply becomes, if networks are so important, how can we use them to make things better? How can we use them to accelerate that diffusion process? And I often argue that, in fact, many of the public health interventions we've created over the past few decades are network interventions. We just don't conceive of them that way. They promote going to get information about health conditions, either through professionals or just talking with your peers. And they attempt to fragment transmission networks or accelerate the diffusion of prophylactic measures and things like that, right? So they are network interventions. We just don't conceive of them that way. So a couple of years we wrote this paper on using social network analysis for program implementation. And this paper tries to provide a broad framework for looking at the stages of the implementation process. What are the things that networks can do, the network analysis field can bring to it to help improve that process? And in the implementation stages literature, you have these four broad stages, right? Exploration, adoption, implementation, and monitoring and sustainment. And exploration is that needs assessment. What's the problem here? What does the problem look like? What's the language we use to describe it? What are the barriers to people doing what we want to do, and so on. And in some ways, this falls under the rubric of what we call network ethnography, right? Is there a network there to even work with? What is the network, right? What is the network position of the people we are using to help us inform and design and define the problem? And I think that's critically important because our community-based partners reach out into the community, right? But they only see part of it. They only see part of the network that they can see. They can't see all of it. And we ask, are there disconnected subgroups or marginal populations that we don't have access to that we need to bring into the fold? And are there isolates that we need to try to capture? And so, for example, here's a kind of stylized version. We have a network here, and we might see that there are these people here who are helping us as our community partners define the problem, right? But those folks are not going to be able to reach our isolates that are up here, up in the corner, right? And then we have a whole subgroup over here that's going to be completely disconnected from our intervention. So we can capture a big part of the community, but without knowing the network, we won't know if we're getting proper definitions of problems, proper program design, and actually reaching everybody. Oh, here they are. This is what I was looking for before, these little circles. Yay. Okay. So, but it helps us think of the community as a network. And when you think of it that way, then the community is no longer this one big thing, but instead a set of perhaps fragmented different clusters and subcultures and subcommunities, perhaps people that are very prominent in the network that we want to be in contact with. Perhaps there are people on the margins, on the periphery, that we need to make extra effort to try to reach, and so on and so forth. So it gives us a way, a perch, if you will, to think about the community in a more discrete, I think, and specific way. Okay, and then the next stage in the process, of course, is designing an intervention. And this sort of falls under the rubric of network interventions and how you use networks to deliver interventions. And a lot of this, what you're going to see, comes from the paper I published in Science a few years ago on network interventions. And quite simply, network interventions are this purposeful efforts to bring about behavior change by generating social influence, using network information either to assist program delivery or at least understand how the program is going to be absorbed and taken in by the community. Now, the chief insight here is this table on a taxonomy of network interventions. And it takes a rather kind of a communication approach, if you will, by treating network interventions along three different dimensions: the strategic, the tactical, and the operationalization. And the easiest way to sort of think about this distinction is reading across that top row, where we look at the strategic level, we want to identify individuals to deliver our program. And the way we have done that most frequently is identify opinion leaders, right? Those people who are most prominent in the network, and we want to get them to be our change agents. Now, from a network perspective, when we talk about those people who are leaders, who are opinion leaders, who occupy central positions in the network, we have at least a dozen different definitions of what it means to be most central in the network. And we have upwards of 100 specific algorithms used to identify central nodes in a network. So from an operational perspective, there are a lot of choices out there. Quite simply, when we think about opinion leaders, we think about those people who receive the most nominations in response to a network question. So I could come into the division, ask everybody, who do you go to for advice when you have a data management problem, count up all of those nominations, and find, who would I find? Matthew would end up being, well, yes, he's the one. Or not, right? It could be somebody else. But we also identify central nodes as those who are closest to everybody, can reach everybody in the fewest steps, or those that lie on the most geodesics, the shortest path, connecting other people, those that have the highest scores on the first eigenvector, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of choices out there. Okay? So this opinion leader intervention is our most typical network intervention. It has been done a lot. It's easy to measure, right? It's intuitively appealing. I can walk into an organization and I can tell the boss, let me do a network intervention. I'm going to find out how important you are. I'll go collect the data, and then we'll have you be the change agent, right? Knowing full well in my mind that that person's not going to end up anywhere near the top in response to most of my network questions. But after they pay the bill, do I tell them that? So the other thing is this has proven effectiveness. We identified over 20 studies as of 2008 that had used network data to identify opinion leaders, have them be change agents, and show statistically significant improvements in health outcomes. This primarily among physicians in hospital or medical care settings. In 2011, Floodgren did a Cochrane review identifying 18 randomized controlled trials where opinion leaders were recruited for behavior change. Most often, this opinion leader intervention was compared to either practice as usual or other interventions using the same materials or different materials and so on, and in all cases, the opinion leader approach turned out to be significant. And in fact, you get a 12 percentage point compliance rate over and above other interventions. That is a huge effect size. I'm telling you, when we do public health communication campaigns, if we got a 12% effective size, we'd be overwhelmed with people coming to our services, and we'd actually have a very healthy nation, right? We don't get anywhere near that kind of uptake from our normal interventions. So these opinion leader interventions, this opinion leader approach is very, very effective, and it makes a lot of sense. And I don't have, again, I could chain you down. We could spend 3 hours. I could show you the R library we have for calculating all of these different kinds of network interventions, and I won't subject you to that either. I'll just show you this graphic that kind of illustrates a lot of these different kinds of interventions, and there are new ones being created all the time. And I'll tell you, when you look at this Cochrane review here, this notion of using in-degree centrality to identify opinion leaders and have them be change agents is the dumbest, the simplest kind of network intervention we could envision, right? When you go back to this table and you look at creating interventions that specifically induce change on the network or rewire the network, these things are going to be much more effective than simply identifying opinion leaders, but we don't do it for some reason. Okay. All right, so how do you select a network intervention, right? So now we've got all these different choices, right? So one of the take-homes is we have a quiver with a lot of arrows in it that we can use to figure out how to bring about behavior change. Which one do I use? Well, of course, it makes a difference. Do you have network data? What kind of network data can you get access to? What are the behavioral characteristics? Is this a product for which we can expect people to embrace and be enthusiastic about? Or is it something they're going to hate, right? Or is this a behavior change that's coming from the CEO and nobody wants to do it? Or is it something that people have been asking and begging for a long time? Those are going to make a difference. But there are sort of ways that you can link theory to intervention choice. Now, this is completely unconstrained by data. This is purely imaginary, too many cups of coffee type thing. But it's this idea of looking at the theoretical mechanism that's driving the behavior in the community, organization, or whatever setting you're in. And if that is the mechanism, then this is the intervention that gets suggested. Okay, so for example, if it's power, if it's an organization, you have a very strong leader, then you're going to have to work with that leader to get behavior change. But what if it's conflict? What if your problem is that you have conflicts within the organization population and subgroups aren't getting along. Well, let's identify bridges that bridge those different subgroups and strengthen those bridges and use them for your intervention. If cohesion is something that's driving, you've got a really good functioning organization, you know what you want to do, then we can use Borgatti's key player algorithm and software to find those nodes that most effectively span the network or those that most effectively fragment it. Or what about isolation, right? We know that adolescents who experience a lot of mental health difficulties, those that are at higher risk for suicide ideation and suicide attempts, are often marginalized in friendship networks and schools, right? So we need to identify those on the periphery and work specifically with them with our messages to try to create a more inclusive environment. Or if we know the thresholds for a population, let's identify those low threshold adopters. They're used to being early in their network. They're used to communicating the idea to other people. Let's work with them, and so on and so forth, right? So that is one potential for thinking about selecting the kind of network intervention you would like. All right, and then the last column here, I've got the wrong one highlighted, is sustainment and monitoring. And a number of years ago, I was working with colleagues at Vanderbilt University. They were doing an obesity treatment program, bringing groups of families that are already obese or at risk for obesity with their children in learning lessons about healthy eating, healthy sleeping, healthy exercise habits, and so on. And lots of our interventions are of this nature. We get people into a group, try to get them to build support networks, learn new behaviors together, and so on. And so we created this cool called Social Network Diagnostics, a tool for monitoring group interventions. And the idea is rather quite simple. The idea is simply, let's come up with our typical standard group of 10 or 12 network indicators. When the group has been meeting for a few weeks, we'll collect network data, and then we will have target metrics for each one of these measures, right? So we don't want to have any isolates. We want everybody to have at least one connection in the network. We want to have at least 50% reciprocity in the ties in the network. We don't want to have different separate subcomponents, and so on and so forth. Now, the target numbers that are in this table are purely fictional. There's nobody ever done this before, so I made them up. We submitted the paper to the journal. I knew the reviewers were going to hate this. Every one of them, they had different comments, but they all agreed on where the hell do these numbers come from, right? And it's like, and I wrote back in the response to review, I don't know, it's the best guess I could come up with. And they accepted it, which shocked the heck out of me. As an editor, I would have said, come on, you got to do better than that. So it was quite simple. At this 3-week measure, we send them back a network diagram. We tell them where they are with their metrics, and then we have specific recommendations. Make sure so-and-so isn't dominating the conversation. Make sure you connect up this person and this person and this person. What was most gratifying about this research is the interventionists loved it. They were so thankful to have a tool that actually gave them something to do specifically, rather than try to get everybody to talk more, right? No, try to get specifically this person to talk more and build a bridge between this subgroup and that subgroup. So that was pretty cool. And then something that I've really been fascinated with lately that's come out now in a couple of papers we've done is this notion of networks as mediators and or moderators of program effects, right? We tend to think of people as individuals, but they are not. They are connected to others. And so with whom they consume our interventions with, and the social context within which that communication occurs matters a lot. And there is evidence that programs are going to have differential effects for people based on their network characteristics, right? If I'm in a friendship network of smokers, a smoking prevention program is going to have a very different effect on me than if I'm already in a network where nobody smokes and nobody supports smoking, right? I don't need that intervention. So breaking down our effects by whether or not people have others in their network of that characteristic, what their position is in the network. Interventions have very different influences on central people versus peripheral people, and so on and so forth. So I think we can do a lot of work in our evaluation work, making sure we're collecting some network data so we understand how those network effects mediate and moderate our interventions. And they actually give us a capability to show interventions working where we otherwise would have concluded they did not. Okay, so I promised you at lunch it was going to be fast. There was a lot of slides, but I was going to get it all in, and I did. So social network theory, it's been around for decades, right? I mean, this is actually a very, very old field in some ways, but it's really blossomed lately, and it's permeated all aspects of science, both physical, biological, and social, which is terrific, and I think it's great, and it's really, really doing well. And I think in many ways, because it's so applicable to so many different things, we don't think of individuals, cells, or anything as isolated, but instead as connected, and that's critically important. And the tools that we have developed have really gotten great. So there's much work to be done. I mean, I think actually in many ways we're still in the beginning when it comes to figuring out how this stuff works. And I'd like to, I need to thank, there's obviously lots of colleagues in some of the articles. You've seen the colleagues that have been involved. My wife, Becca Davis, has been helpful through doing all of this work. I run a group called the Center for Applied Network Analysis that meets regularly, and we have lots of discussions. So networks are really important, and it's been my network actually that's enabled me to do a lot of this work, and I'm really appreciative of them, and you know who you are out there. So thank you all for your attention very much. I'm delighted to come and share this work with you, and thank you, Sevgi, again for the invitation. Questions? Ian.
Thanks for a very engaging talk that covered so much. Yeah, thanks, Tom, for covering so much in so little time and doing it in such an energetic way. A couple of thoughts come to mind from the beginning of the talk. So there was talk of implications of if some sort of intervention or practice is culturally compatible with the population or group, then we can say certain things downstream.
Yeah.
So how do you determine that sort of cultural compatibility? Because we might, if we could know that beforehand, we could know which intervention to roll out.
Right. And I think that goes back to doing better network ethnography, right? Doing qualitative field work and the legwork required to understand what this community is thinking all about. That finding comes from a really classic study done by Marshall Becker, published in 1970 among public health officers in New York, Ohio, and Michigan. And they introduced two different interventions, one with high adoption potential, low adoption potential, and he found the public health officers that had the highest centrality would adopt the high adoption potential one early, but delay for the late adoption one. So in that case, he knew specifically this intervention is going to be accepted and the other one is not. So the one that had high adoption potential was measles immunization, and the low adoption potential was diabetes screening, right? So the infectious versus the chronic disease. So we knew pretty clearly at that time the culture embraced one and not the other. But you're right, there are a lot of, what about condom use? Well, when is that culturally compatible and when is it not?
Right, exactly.
And that's a pretty pertinent example for here. So, I don't have a full answer to that, but I think doing the qualitative work gets you a good start on it at any rate. And
the second question has to do with the stability of different networks over time. And so I would imagine that, for certain types of networks, they might be stable over the period over which you're rolling out an intervention, but different types of networks might be more volatile. And so how do you deal with that? Because just even the fact of, but by the very nature of observing the network, you might be changing it after you take the...
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story. We did this pretty big study of high school students from 10th through 12th grade. And we were piloting our survey in the spring of 2010. And so we went out to the classrooms, we had a paper and pencil survey, and we had a sort of yearbook roster attached to the end of it with every kid's picture and ID number. And we give out the surveys, and in no time at all, what happens? I'll friend you if you friend me, right? And so I was like, holy cow, I was completely not expecting that. So we had to build into the protocol specifically, you're not allowed to look at your cell phone until you finish the survey, right? And so you're right. We can affect the network simply by measuring it. And we also have network dynamics that we know occur. And I've been fortunate to work in adolescent school settings where the network dynamics are not overwhelmingly crazy. I've also worked with injection drug user populations in which those populations do turn over a fair amount. We did a network study of IDU users in Baltimore. We found that people were only willing to engage in risk behavior with those that they were closest to, right? The people they nominated first as a friend, that'd be the only person they'd share syringes with. But when we looked over time, we saw that within 6 months, 50% of those close friends were gone, right? In prison, moving around and whatnot. And so that turnover creates a real challenge for using the network data for an intervention. Having said that, overall network structures tend not to change very much. And sometimes when there are substitutions and changes, it's the same kind of person, right? Given the tendency of homophily along demographic as well as behavioral characteristics, you know, I'll swap out Matthew for Ian. No big deal, right? The same kind of person, sort of.
with Michigan alum.
Beards, glasses.
I'm Ellis Campbell in the Division of HIV/AIDS Prevention. We measure networks based on the genetic distances between the viruses. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes we have no signal of actually who are sharing needles or who are sexual partners. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on using one network that may resemble another but not actually depict the other one, and how informative that might be for informing these interventions.
I think it can be critically informative because it does give you a sense of what the disease network is, right? So now all of a sudden people are actually the links and the disease signal is the node. And so now you can approach it that way. Where is it spreading? Where is it most prevalent and whatnot? And so I think it actually does a lot of good, and you can use some of the current network statistical tools to kind of analyze it and see what that structure is. And the neat thing about that is you would expect that disease network to look different than a human network. So you should see a signal, for example, in the man structure, the triadic census, right? That should look differently for this network than for a human network or a primate network and so on. And you can estimate ergo models or even Sienna models to see how the network is evolving and changing. So the tools are there, and I think a lot of network analysis to me, and horrors to say from a scientific perspective, is descriptive. But descriptive is really, really valuable, right? I mean, physicists describe the universe. That turns out to be a valuable thing to do. Geologists describe our Earth. So I think it's really good to have this deep description because then it can tell you what's happening with this. How is it evolving? Where is it going? Yeah.
Thanks.
You're welcome. I'm so generous. Awesome. Spot on 1 hour. Well done. Yeah.